Mike is a professor of politics at Cambridge, and he and Diane Coyle, who spoke yesterday afternoon, are the co-directors of the Bennett Institute of Public Policy here, and they have been a great source of support for us. They have been a partner in our endeavor. They are the ones who turned us on to the Muller Institute. I've worked quite closely with them when I sat on the board of the Bennett Institute. And I wanted to bring attention to the extraordinary work that Mike and Diane have done to establish that institute, and starting this August, that institute transforms into the Bennett School of Public Policy at Cambridge. So it's a very, very big moment for the history of public policy, not the history of public policy, I'm showing my own bias here, a very big moment for the study of public policy at Cambridge and very relevant to this gathering. So Mike, just honoring you. I don't know if Diane is here. I don't see her. But a big thank you, and with that, let me turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Can I just check, first of all, can people at the back hear me? No. No. How about that? Better? Yeah, okay. So just a word to my fellow panelists, speak right into the mic. So thank you, Gary, and thank you to all of you for gathering here. As Gary says, I'm very much involved in the public policy work here at Cambridge. And whilst in some ways we're very much at the policy end of some of the debates and questions that we're talking about here today, we also do a lot of work in and around values and narratives. So very interested in this particular session as well. This panel is going to look at moral visions for a neoliberal, for after neoliberalism. And I think it's going to broadly cover three kinds of question. The sort of main focus here is whether the neoliberal project, however we characterize that, to what extent did it rest upon a sort of moral and ethical common sense forged around ideas about the egalitarian or indeed emancipatory power of markets? And was that the same kind of common sense in different geographies? Then I think we're going to be looking at the popular level here, perhaps in a bit more depth than we've done so far today, at the question of how do we characterize the sort of moral orientations of citizens, again in different countries. How do we characterize that in relation to our understanding of neoliberalism? And is there a sense in which neoliberalism has a popular, effective dimension, or indeed has shaped popular understandings in different ways? And then thirdly, there's always three, the third, I guess, bucket of things that I guess with this crowd we're bound to talk about is what kind of moral orientation should the opponents of neoliberalism articulate and indeed try to inculcate? And is there indeed a singular kind of moral outlook, which is the sort of going to be the winner after neoliberalism? So that's my sense of what I think we're going to be talking about. We've got a really good panel to pick over these issues. I'm just going to briefly introduce you to them. Then each of them will speak for 12 to 15 minutes. I'll be strict. I'll pass this note round that I've written, and then I'll be in conversation with them for a short while. Then I'll open it up to you. So immediately to my left is Sacha Hillhorst. Sacha is a senior research fellow at Commonwealth and a postdoc at the LSE, and she has been conducting ethnographic work on the changing politics of England's post-industrial towns. And I think that's what we're going to be hearing, is that we're going to be hearing about that research. Further to her left, Jason Jackson. Jason is an associate professor of political economy at MIT and director of the Political Economy Lab. His research looks at the role of states and markets in capitalism, and he has projects going on economic nationalism, industrial policy, and the digital economy. And he is the author of two books, no less, two forthcoming books on India and Brazil's development strategies. To his left, we have Anton Jäger. Anton is a departmental lecturer at University College, Oxford. His History of Basic Income, which is a co-written history, is now out, I think, with Chicago Press. And then last and definitely not least, on the far left here is Felicia Wong. Felicia is the outgoing president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, and she is now chief strategist for the Roosevelt Society. She has advised the Biden-Harris transition team, so that's an interesting backdrop, certainly for this conversation. She served on the G7 Economic Resilience Panel and is Vice Chair of the Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. So that's the panel. Without further ado. You was, so no longer, sorry, yes, you're no longer in that role. Sacha, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm here to talk to you about moral visions in post-industrial England. And I'm an ethnographer by trade. And specifically, I conducted the bulk of my fieldwork in Mansfield, a former mining and manufacturing town in the Midlands, a little ways north of here in this country. And for those of you who are not familiar, among many things that make it politically salient, it was one of the places that had one of the highest Brexit votes back in 2016. It is now Labour held, once again, but on a vastly reduced turnout. And if current polls are anything to go by, it will be comfortably won by Reform UK next time round. So that's sort of the setting, the sort of place where there used to be lots and lots of coal mines, textile factories, which have now gone and have been replaced largely by work in distribution centres, in care homes, in supermarkets. And I went to live in Mansfield. I joined people for celebrations and football matches, one funeral, and tried to get a sense of how people related to politics and what made their political views meaningful in the context of their lives. And the first thing to say, especially also in relation to the topic of this panel, is that morality was incredibly important in making these political evaluations, particularly the sense that politicians were deeply immoral. This structured engagements with politics in the pub, but also in in-depth interviews, in the way people spoke and thought about politics. And the thing that I kept hearing almost as soon as I moved to Mansfield was, they're all corrupt. There was a wide array of different idioms for this locally. So they're greasing their palms, they're feathering their own nest, they're taking backhanders, they're on the take, lining their pockets. And this was not an accusation of corruption strictly in sort of the World Bank definition or the Transparency International definition, but it conveyed this sense of decay of the civic realm, the sense that politicians are not in it for us, that they are self-serving. And in many ways, the values that lots of my interlocutors would see as the best values of the community, politicians were seen as the opposite of. So if to be a member of the community in good standing means being generous, politicians were seen as being greedy. If being a good member of the community meant looking out for others, politicians were looking out only for themselves. And this is a huge problem if we're wanting to articulate a moral vision, because any time politicians articulated a moral argument, many of the people I spend my time with would say, how dare you tell me how I'm supposed to live my life? How dare you, when you are taking money left, right, and center? And honestly, it's a problem for anybody who wants the government to do anything, because we need people to sometimes believe that, for example, you might have to pay higher taxes, but your life will be better. We'll invest in public services. All of that was seen as just lies. This is not, of course, universally true. Mansfield, like any place, has a variety of political orientations within it. But it was true of about 1 in 3 people I spoke to who understood politics primarily through this frame of corruption. Hugely salient. And Labour had very much become implicated in this. They were seen as, all being as bad as each other. And that's in part because Labour had been in charge locally for a very long time and had become the face of structural decline as the market dwindled and the pits closed and whatnot. And this is in part a structural question. There was this request that politicians show which side they're on, that they stand up and fight for you. But when I spoke to the local councillors, they would tell me that what they needed to do was bring in jobs. And so they were going around, sweet-talking Amazon, really. They didn't feel they could bring that fight because they needed to attract these businesses. And so that's what people were seeing. It seemed like politicians were speaking to a different constituency, not to them. And it really fortified this sense that they're not looking out for us. And from these brief opening remarks, it'll be clear that the common sense I encountered was really shaped in lots of ways by the labor tradition, but it was also infused with lots of other things. So it wasn't so much that neoliberalism had replaced these other modes of thinking about politics, it had fused with it. For example, if we think about the importance of work, which was hugely salient to so many of the people that I spent my time with, very commonly when I talk to people about their children and the values they try to pass on to their children, the main thing, and often the only thing they mentioned, was work ethic, which I found striking. And you can see how that comes out of certain working class experiences and labor traditions. But when it fuses with a social conservatism, you can see how it becomes attacks on benefit claimants. When it fuses with market logic, you can see how it becomes a defense of the wealth of the ultra-rich, which just last month I was doing group interviews and focus groups about wealth and wealth taxes, and I was taken aback by how many of the people in the room who were working class and lower middle class, nurses, teaching assistants, people who worked in supermarkets, would defend the wealth of the very wealthy on the basis that they had worked for it, and to tax it would be punitive and would send the wrong message about the value of hard work, which is challenging. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do stuff, but we need to be smart. We need to put in the work, building local infrastructures to generate ideas and make them into common sense. When the Conservatives made a play for Mansfield, as they did in a big way in the 2010s, they really leaned into this desire for political renewal and this sense of the emancipatory power of markets, both in the sense that people could become entrepreneurs, that instead of being a cog in the wheel of nationalized industry, you could be an entrepreneur, you could be setting forth into the world bravely. But also in the sense of liberating yourself from tradition and being sort of an empowered consumer in the marketplace of ideas. So people often told me that they did not vote Labour mindlessly, as they felt their parents had done. And there was a sense that was empowering, that they were, throwing off something that had become limiting. And yet, this more neoliberal vision didn't work for Mansfield either, because while people so often told me that they were happy to choose to do their own thinking, and indeed sometimes do their own research, they also felt that there were no real choices available to them. They're all the same. Nobody's speaking to my concerns. And the Conservatives were soon, cast aside, just as Labour had been. With only this deepening sense of politicians being untrustworthy and no one looking out for them. So how do we get around this? I did actually leave Mansfield feeling optimistic about the possibilities of progressive politics, because there was a lot to draw on, and a lot of that came from people's regard for their neighbors and local identities. There was an allotment, so a community vegetable and fruit garden where I spent lots of time, and there was a councillor there called Amanda, and everybody knew she would be there all day. So if you had a problem with your housing, you could come to the allotment, and Amanda would help. The fruit and veg from the garden would be distributed to local families who were on lower incomes. And Amanda was a real lefty. Like, she was a card-carrying socialist. She did not hide it. And yet, people with politics very different from hers voted for her very consistently. And she improved her margins and her vote share every election because people knew that she was in it for them. And these are the sorts of local infrastructures we need to be building. This can't just be about top-down ideas generation. It is also about people who are trusted locally. Those local ties for lots of the people I spoke to and spent my time with were far more important than their own sense of their ideology. And people would look out for their neighbors. This is a great instinct which was important to people's lives. Very briefly, two other elements that I think could anchor a moral vision for the era that comes after this current interregnum is respect for hard work, and particularly the working class cosmopolitanism that can come with that. I spoke to people who in some cases had pretty dodgy views on a lot of things, but they would also say, and I'm thinking of one man in particular who was a warehouse operative, and he told me, if you work the same work as me, if you sweat the same sweat as me, I can only respect you. This was hugely salient to lots of people, across lines of difference, across lines of nationality especially. Builders who told me on the building site, you have to give everybody equal respect, no matter what job you do, no matter where you're from. And of course, in practice, these things are much more fraught. But there's convivial ideology here that we can draw on. The old sort of far-right canard that they're taking our jobs didn't exist in practice. All sorts of other forms of racism did exist, but not that form. Like work was a source of solidarity. And then finally, a snippet of common sense that we can very much draw on is the fact that people had very little respect for the price mechanism, especially when it came to essentials. This came up a lot in relation to supermarket prices, which are a constant topic of conversation. When I'm in Mansfield now, this is what people will talk to me about almost every time we speak. And they will say that in the local Morrisons, as soon as the discount items are put on the shelves, one woman told me, it's like the zombie apocalypse, because people are flooding in, and this is obviously because of cost of living pressures. And it's unacceptable to me and also to the people I speak to. The same is true for rents and housing costs, water, other utilities. There's absolutely a willingness to say that that is wrong. There's no respect or no sense that, well, this is just the price that the market has set for it. So there's a lot to work with here, even though Mansfield is your classic former Labour stronghold that is now shifting rightward politically. I actually think that if we really do the work from the ground up, there's lots we can do, drawing on that sense of neighborliness, those local attachments, this working class cosmopolitanism that comes through work, and this belief that people deserve to live, that we deserve to have access to the essentials. It's not going to be easy. Clearly, it's going to be very hard to espouse a moral vision if most of our spokespeople for it, especially those who are elected representatives, are mistrusted and seen to be self-enriching, corrupt figures. But there's also lots of good that we can and should draw on as we sort of rebuild solidarities and construct a new political project. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sacha. That's a really interesting piece of research and insights from it. Over to you, Jason.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks very much for the organizers for inviting me to share some thoughts here today on this panel. Yes, I'll try to speak directly to the mic. So I'd like to focus my talk today on the moral ambiguities that are characteristic not only of neoliberalism, but also of modern capitalism. Earlier this week, as I was thinking about how I wanted to frame my remarks, I thought that I might begin with Luigi Mangione. And so when Gary raised Mangione yesterday afternoon, my initial thought was that he stole my thunder. But on the other hand, I was worried that beginning with Mangione assassinating United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson would seem a bit left field. So instead, I'm really happy that Gary put this on the table. because I believe that the Mangione case helps to illustrate some of the moral ambiguities that we're grappling with in our current moment. That is, on one hand, Mangione committed a brazen capital crime. Yet on the other hand, he's received so much support from people who identify with this frustration with the rapaciousness of privatized healthcare. Further, many people are also drawn to him for other reasons, and not just the young people of the TikTok generation that Gary honed in on in the deep dive and being sucked into the cell phone vortex, but also, as some of my older colleagues have told me, he's really good looking. Just Google Mangione and you'll see, not only his looks, but the discussion. But the ambiguities nevertheless resound. First, people resonate with Mangione because of the high cost of healthcare and the unethical behavior of private insurance, which many, of course, can empathize with. Yet Mangione is from a very wealthy family with a net worth of probably around $100 billion. How do we make sense of this? More fundamentally, despite widespread hatred and distrust of privatized healthcare in the United States and elsewhere, there's also little appetite for a state-based alternative, which many fear would feature death panels of bureaucrats and other similarly dystopian outcomes. So there's a distrust of the private corporate form and a distrust of the state. This is important to note because my goal is not to make a facile, in my comments today, not to make a facile corporation's bad state good claim. Instead, I want to suggest that we have to think critically about both the public and private sectors. Indeed, American politics is currently beset by two business figures who also exemplify the moral ambiguities of modern capitalism. First, Elon Musk, who for years was admired by many on the, at least center left, if not for his entrepreneurialism, which his cheerleaders on the right are drawn to, then at least for his role in advancing the EV revolution. Of course, it's worth noting that much of the pro-Musk narrative on EVs conveniently ignores Tesla's deep reliance on tax subsidies, but nevertheless. And of course, we have Donald Trump, whose pre-politics, pre-media career was built in real estate development, an arena of business that's famous for unethical behavior and outright corruption. Ultimately, much of real estate development is about contacts and kickbacks. Yet Trump makes massive political gains by claiming that he will drain the swamp, thus seemingly turning a potential political weakness into a strength. I think it resonates with some of the comments that you made from your findings in Mansfield. My sense is that this has political appeal, not because people are naive and don't see the irony. It's not a sort of false consciousness, but rather that many see the state itself as a problem that then forces private actors to do whatever they have to get the deal done. These are some of the moral ambiguities at work in politics. Yet it is worth noting that much of this is not new. Capitalism has always been riven by moral ambiguities. In particular, there are deep tensions and anxieties about the profit-making activities of capital that's rolled back all the way to Bernard Mandeville's fable of the bees, which asks whether private gains reap public benefits, to the double nature that Weber identified in The Spirit of Capitalism in his book Economy and Society, where he posited a deeply normative distinction between two types of capitalist behavior. One sober, steady, shrewd, the other illicit, rapacious, and irrationally acquisitive. As Stefan and Noam have noted in their joint work, these two different types of capitalism were, for Weber, as mutually opposed as it is possible for two mental and moral forces to be. The former is based on rational calculations that Weber saw as characteristic of bourgeois business practices, while the latter relied on rent-seeking, black market profiteering, and risky and politically opportunistic adventurism. Weber used examples from the Gilded Age United States to illustrate these categorically distinct modes of capitalist conduct, according the latter illicit, charismatic, and rapacious mode to the infamous robber barons such as Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Henry Villard. So again, figures that Noam put on the table for us yesterday. But note that Weber explicitly framed the business practices of the robber barons in the United States in colonial terms as most similar to some, and this is a quote, as most similar to some age-old phenomenon, the huge rapacious enterprises in the financial and colonial sphere, and occasional trade with this mixture of piracy and slave hunting. For Weber, the spirit of robber capitalism was radically opposed to the rationalized routine of the modern business enterprise. There were distinct structural elements. In my forthcoming book, Traders, Speculators, and Captains of Industry, I argue that over the long durée from the late colonial period to the present, policy elites in India grappled with related problems of how to determine which business actors, whether foreign or domestic, to support through their industrial policy interventions. Which business figures were merely traders and speculators? These are some of the things they grappled with. That is, which were unproductive and extractive, operating through business practices such as financial usury and labor exploitation, and who were the real industrialists, who sought to upgrade firm-level capabilities and invest in technological learning and upgrading, precisely the kinds of activities that we all hope, all of us here in this room, I believe, hope that industrial policy will promote. How to identify the captain of industry? Thus, I argue that by viewing industrial policy and foreign investment policy making and the business actors that these policies were intended to work through, remember, these are policies that are designed explicitly in a capitalist context. They rely on business firms, typically private. In this way, they constructed what I call moral orders of capitalist legitimacy that sought to distinguish between extractive and productive business actors on one hand, and by constraining the former, so constraining the extractive ones, and promoting those deemed to be productive. I would suggest that we're also racked by these moral ambiguities on a personal level with our everyday, mundane, daily economic decisions. We worry about labor exploitation and environmental degradation through globalized supply chains and rail when these periodically manifest in outright disasters, as with the Rana Plaza collapse in Dhaka on April 24, 2013, yet we still purchase clothes made by the labels that we found in the rubble. Few arenas exemplify this more than the digital economy, and these moral ambiguities are in turn exemplified in many respects by Uber. The firm that on one hand is the largest of the platforms that operate in the so-called gig economy, which I should note was at one point optimistically referred to as the sharing economy, but it seems that moment has passed where technology platforms were seen as ushering in a softer, kinder, more communitarian and egalitarian form of capitalism, and much more now as a rapacious and exploitative system and set of business actors. We recognize these elements in Uber and its counterparts around the world, so Didi in China, Grab in Southeast Asia, 99 in Brazil, Bolt in Africa, etc. Yet we still often use these platforms to get rides, order food, and so forth. These are a few examples of the moral dilemmas of everyday life under capitalism. This thinking about the sort of extent to which the digital economy serves as a useful terrain for thinking about these kinds of moral dilemmas has led to my current project on the rise of digital capitalism, where again the moral ambiguities of business actors are exemplified by Uber. So in my comments now, I'll draw a bit on work that I've been doing with some of my students in my political economy lab in several cities and countries around the world. It seems in many respects timely to think about tech, as many believe that we're entering an era of techno-capitalism. This mode of capital accumulation and societal governance is ostensibly the outcome of the rapid pace of digital innovation and technological change over the course of the past couple decades. But this is an illusion. Techno-capitalism is not simply an outcome of developments in computational technologies. It's more fundamentally driven by shifting organizational forms of corporate power, deepening processes of financialization, and the evolving relationship between business, society, and the state. The techno-capitalist moment has been ushered in by the waning project of neoliberalism. The belief that national societies and the global economy can and should, I emphasize the should, to highlight the normative background of underpinning of neoliberalism, as we've been charged in this panel to do, that these should be organized through the institutional mechanism of self-regulating markets. There's a vibrant debate on whether neoliberalism may be near its end stage, sort of what we're doing here, perhaps being replaced by new forms of leftist statism in some places and reactionary modernisms in others. Yet the neoliberal ideal may well be exemplified by the rise of technology platforms that offer the promise of creating perfect markets through computational techniques, seamlessly connecting buyers and suppliers. These technology firms use algorithmic processes to construct and aggregate fragmented markets, thus capturing scale economies through network effects. The allure of technology platforms lies in the promise of coupling economic efficiency with political liberty by providing individual buyers and sellers on both sides of the platform with freedom of choice, the neoliberal dream. These technologies constitute a claim to modernity that is compelling to both policymakers and the public, enabling technology platforms to precipitate a radical transformation of cities and urban economic life, go where you want, get what you want instantly, while presenting a range of vexing challenges for democratic forms of urban governance. Platform firms just claim to be technocratic and neutral, even as they challenge the legitimacy of public sector control of urban spaces. My research in this area focuses on the entry of ride-hailing firms in urban mobility markets, spaces that are a variegated mix of large-scale, centralized public sector providers and relatively small, fragmented, and often informal private sector players. Urban mobility markets provide a rich and compelling arena through which to observe the demise of neoliberalism and the dawn, perhaps, of techno-capitalism. Platform firms thus constitute new modes of capital accumulation and market governance that appear to have superseded the state, yet they rely on enabling regulatory and legal rules at the global, national, and municipal levels that structure distributions of power and authority, as well as material gains and losses. In turn, ride-hailing's disruption has generated surprisingly diverse and often unexpected reactions in different political economies in the developing and industrialized world. But a common outcome is the concentration of power in oligopolistic platform firms, the institutionalization of increasingly precarious conditions of work, and the generation of novel forms of resistance from above and below. Crucially, however, I argue that the rational technical logics of platform firms are embedded in moral technologies that hold the universalizing appeal of efficiency and modernity. Thus, for example, urban mobility markets should be seen as moral and economic orders, not simply because mobility is an essential public service, but also because they constitute alternative institutional mechanisms of societal governance. South Africa provides a particularly generative case through which to consider platform capitalism. It occupies a particular place in the global political economy. On one hand, during the 1980s heyday of Reaganite, Thatcherite neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus, apartheid South Africa was framed as an anachronistic holdover from an earlier time. Yet apartheid was also emblematic of the racialized capitalism of the mid-20th century, colonialism in most of the world, Jim Crow rules in the United States, and so forth. So let's consider for a moment mobility and platform capitalism in South Africa. On one hand, Uber has entered South Africa and generated familiar forms of controversy, yet it has also raised key sets of specific issues. Mobility for the poor in South Africa was governed in the apartheid era by a taxi system. Really, these are minibuses or kumbis that were designed to move black workers from townships to white areas for work, and then crucially move them back out of those areas by nightfall. This system clearly exemplified the system of spatialized and racialized control orchestrated by the state. Yet it also created opportunities for black entrepreneurship through ownership of the vehicles that provided workers with transportation. Again, these moral ambiguities. Uber has inverted this model. In South Africa, Uber has instituted a fairly unique system that differs from its operations in most of the other 98 or so countries in which it can be found. Recognizing that the fundamental challenge in developing countries is that workers who are most likely to be drivers cannot afford to own a vehicle. This is also an issue, by the way, in rich countries. Uber created a system where it would identify vehicle owners, which of course in South Africa are economic and racial elites, and explicitly integrate them into the platform through a system of limited slots. These vehicle owners would then contract who that control small fleets of cars, anywhere from a few to 40 or 50, and engage drivers to actually drive the cars through both formal and informal contractual mechanisms. Now, this system has had a number of effects, not least with shifting risk downwards, so drivers have to pay all the operational costs, deal with the vagaries of Uber's pricing system, and so forth, while shifting many of the gains upwards to vehicle owners and, of course, to Uber itself. So effectively, Uber on one hand allows for employment opportunities for low-income black drivers. Unemployment in South Africa is extremely high, approaching 40%, yet did so by reinscribing apartheid-era forms of class and race-based structure. This might seem novel in some respects because it seems to be a movement away from the state, but it's worth remembering that apartheid was always a corporate form. So in this sense, South Africa exemplifies a general condition rather than being unique. Indeed, from the perspective of neoliberalism, South Africa was part of the neoliberal imaginary for members of the Montpellier Society, as Quincelodian's work has shown through the figure of economist Wilhelm Röpke. So to conclude, how do we make sense of this picture that I've tried to paint of the political economy of digital capitalism? Much of the discourse has been framed through compelling concepts like techno-feudalism and so forth. But really what I want to reiterate today in my remarks is that my goal was not to reinscribe again a corporation's bad state good trope, but rather the hope was to trigger a discussion about the moral ambiguities that characterize both private profit-making and state action under modern capitalism, using the digital platform economy as a case through which we might see how the rational technical logics of platform firms are fundamentally embedded in moral technologies. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Moving on, so Anton.
Can you hear me? Does this work? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm a historian of political thought, so not an economist or a political economist, so I'm going to be talking a bit more vaguely and broadly, maybe, but there's some political economy that will figure in the story, very importantly. And I mainly want to return or start by going back to Noam's opening speech yesterday, which pretty much, I think, established a synonymity between two things, which I think is very helpful and which has been visible in every panel ever since, namely that post-neoliberalism means restoring capital discipline. This is basically what it means, and the question we're trying to figure out is how do we do that? And I think through the discussions, there have been three dimensions to this task. The first is ideational, so how do you change the policy atmosphere or the policy space in which ideas circulate? I think a lot has changed there, and Certainly some paradigms have been tumbling over. I think there's an institutional state-level story to this, which is about institutional capacity. Is there the personnel to actually enact these ideas? But something we've heard less about, and which Noam did talk about as well, is what is the society-level precondition for the restoration of capital discipline and therefore for post-neoliberalism. And Noam made mention to a term, namely developmental coalitions, which I think is also a reference to Mark Blythe's notion of a growth coalition. I think developmental coalition is even more ambitious than just a growth coalition. But we saw it in a presentation this morning, for example, on the PT, so on the Brazilian Workers' Party, is that the institutional precondition, namely to be able to build these multinationally competitive firms, comes with a coalition, namely the PT, so the Lulismo coalition. And actually to talk about capital discipline without this coalition either requires a really strong authoritarian civil service, I think that's what Vivek Shibber says in his work on developmentalism, or you'd actually need, not necessarily democratic, because I think, for example, the CCP is also a developmental coalition, but it's not democratic. But without this precondition, it's immensely hard to restore capital discipline. And the aim of my story, therefore, is to talk about the political constraints on post-neoliberalism. What makes it so hard for us to get there? And, I mean, analogously, that is also a story about the political effects of neoliberalism. Not just what has neoliberalism done to inequality, to economics, to international trade, to philosophy, but what has it done to our political culture, and how is the political culture we inhabit still constraining for the type of move past neoliberalism that we're trying to affect. And there's a broader, I'd say, chronological but almost anthropological story I want to tell here, which is a story about the development of civil society. I even want to refer to Aristotle. So Aristotle, in his political theory, says man is a herd animal, but not just a herd animal. He's a political, or they're a political animal as well. And that means I think you can read the story of what has happened to civil society, and this is mainly a story of the Atlantic world, but I think you can extrapolate globally as well, as on two axes. So a social axis, and that is the question, what has happened to associational life since the 1980s? What is the story of civil society? How has it been restructured? And then there's a political axis, namely what has happened to political life. And obviously they intersect and they interact, but they're not completely the same. And if you were like hard quantitative about this, you could even find certain aggregates to measure these two axes. For the social axis, we can look at an aggregate, for example, of union density, just associational membership, religious life, etc. And then for the political axis, we can choose maybe an aggregate of election turnout, strike activity, but also protest activity, of course. And then thereby, that gives you two, not neatly comparable, I mean, it's a very rough estimate, but it does tell you something by which you can kind of track what political culture has actually been shaped by neoliberalism since the 1980s. Now, what we see, if you add up this data, and I actually had to look up some of it, and it's really, really quite fascinating, is a broadly X-shaped graph. So what happened since the 1980s is a really steep world historic decline in associational life, mainly in developing countries, but also across the world. Now, the most spectacular symptom of this is, of course, the steep fall in union density, but it extends also to all kinds of voluntary clubs. You just need to read Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone to just get a sense of the extent of this crisis. Although I think he wasn't fully able to estimate, for example, that now this would even affect religious institutions, which is a recent American story, but there the kind of crisis of associational life has really taken on quite apocalyptic dimensions. So that is the sort of constant decline you've seen in the last 40 years. On the political axis, the story is more ambiguous. So what you see in the 1980s and 1990s in that early offensive phase of neoliberalism is a steep rise in depoliticization. So that means declining voter turnout, declining strike activity, and even declining protest activity. And the data on this is also quite telling. There is this brief blip in the early 2000s with the anti-Iraq war protests, but it's really the exception that proves the rule, is that depoliticization really spreads across society. And that is the era of what is often called in the theoretical literature post-politics. So Peter Mayer or, for example, Chantal Mouffe have written about this, but in a quantitative sense, post-politics is visible because you have a decline on both of these axes. So associational decline and political decline. What happens after 2008 is a paradoxical development, namely that there's an acceleration of the associational crisis. Someone mentioned it yesterday, union density is now at historic lows in American history. That's not just an American story, it's also a European story. Religious life is now also affected, and there is talk, of course, after COVID of a loneliness epidemic, which even has had really rough medical effects. On the political axis, the story is really fascinating because you have an explosion of politicization after 2008. And the first metric of this is obviously protest activity. There's a book by journalist Vincent Bevins, which actually estimates that in human history, there was no time in which there was such long sustained and numerous protests that is in the 2010s. So he calls the 2010s the decade of protest. I mean, I just want to cite some American numbers. I think 25 million Americans went into the street in the summer of 2020 to protest the killing of George Floyd. We could talk about January 6th as a kind of right-wing version of just how popular protest has become on the right. But I mean, the data about this is really quite spectacular. The 2010s are a decade of protest, and it's easy to measure it. Even election turnout, and we could talk about America here, but take something like the European elections, which in many ways are the most profoundly or like uninspiring elections you can imagine. Even there has been a quite significant uptick in the last 5 years where more people are voting. So in the aggregate, it is obviously also calculated in that, yes, more people are turning out to vote. The story this gives us is obviously a story of the post-2008 era of one of repoliticization without reinstitutionalization, so resocialization. So there's been more political engagement than before. It's a clear contrast with the post-politics of the 90s and the 2000s, but it has not gone hand in hand with the institutionalized engagement that we know from the 20th century. And I mean, there's a book coming out, hopefully early next year, which kind of puts this into a schematic overview. It's, once again, slightly impressionistic, but I think the data bear this out. We can draw a chronology of the 20th century as the era of mass politics, and there's a really wild period of mass politics in the 1930s, both in the US but also in Germany, in which you have high politicization, so a lot of voting, a lot of protest activity, but also high institutionalization. To be active in the 1930s was to be in a union or in a party, whether that meant the NSDAP or the Communist Party. Then you have a quieter period of mass politics, I'd say in the 50s and 60s, where the politicization axis drops, although that's an ambiguous story because the 60s and 70s are obviously also very impressive when it comes to protest activity. But the associational level remains quite high. Then the 1990s and the 2000s are that post-political era in which you could say both associational and political activity is on a low. And then what I've tried to call after 2008 the era of hyperpolitics. That's a hypothetical concept which is open to criticism, but it's trying to capture this new K-shaped recovery, as I call it, between a really steep increase in protest activity and politicization, but the continued decline of associational and civic institutions. And so hyperpolitics, I think, is one morphology for understanding what's happened to a political culture so deeply shaped by neoliberalism, is that the cost of political expression have greatly decreased, partly also through the internet, but the institutional side of what used to be political engagement in the 20th century has not returned. And I think, once again, this is a key constraint on what makes the restoration of capital discipline for a post-neoliberal order very difficult, is that even if the ideas are there and the personnel is there, the capacity to build the coalitions has proven massively, massively difficult. And I think it's actually haunting a lot of the conversations we're having here. So before I finish, I want to talk about two explanatory questions or even causal questions. Why is there this K-shaped recovery, so high politicization, low socialization after 2008? I mean, the answer is staring us in the face. It's a product of 2008. In fact, even the Arab Spring, which is the first explosion of protest activity, is indirectly a product of the freezing of international capital markets, whereby there are these exchange crises in many Arab states, which then leads to these bread riots, which then leads to protest. So 2008 really is the causal spark that leads to the protest era. The question, of course, why does this not return us to the 20s and 30s, in which high politicization went hand in hand with high socialization? And there you have to talk about a question about what are the constraints on the reinstitutionalization of political engagement. And I think there you can talk about horizontal or vertical constraints. The vertical constraints are well known. It's very difficult, for example, to found new parties in the US. It's legally enormously forbidding. It's very hard to start a union. And it's even harder also to start certain kind of civic associations. It's also, of course, a question of finance, so the causal arrows are messy, but they obviously correlate. So that, I think, is the important vertical story. There's obviously, in Europe, where it's easier to form new parties. There's also the story told by the Irish political scientist Peter Mayer about ruling the void, where the cartelization of parties and their insulation from their electorate and basically retrenchment in the state has also made this type of new institutional work very difficult. At the same time, there is a horizontal constraint story, which is less about the constraints on the level of the state, but more on the level of individual versus collective action. And there, I think the proliferation of individualized exit options, to use like Albert Hirschman's term, is really one of the most spectacular elements of the moral effect of neoliberalism, where fewer and fewer people think or seem to believe that collective action, like joining a party or joining a union, is preferable to individualized solutions. So say you feel that your salary can no longer afford the goods you want to buy in the supermarket. It's actually a conversation I had with a friend in Belgium. He says, well, the first reaction is not to join a union, but actually just to put my money into Bitcoin because it's inflation-proof, so to say, and therefore I will be able to opt out of the instability of the market. There obviously is now the internet, which has radically decreased the cost of political expression, but thereby also made it very, very easy to basically do politics without any institutional framework. And anyone who spent any time online can I think, testify to this phenomenon is that high politicization with low institutionalization is basically how the internet was set up constitutively, I say. And then finally, there is, I'd say, a way of doing individualized voice, to use Hirschman, which is quite radical, which I think is Luigi Mangioni's strategy, namely, I'm just going to shoot a healthcare CEO, and that is my way of doing politics on my own. So it's not collective action, but it's a kind of heroic version of the voice, in that he hopes thereby he can establish political change, but it's not the same as Bernie, who actually tried to take over the Democratic Party and give the US public healthcare system. So the proliferation of exit options, I think, provides a kind of horizontal story about where this comes from. And that's where I'm going to end, because I think we now have a clear sense of the constraints, but I do think that this political limit on post-neoliberalism is something that's been under-discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. And then just to finish off this first round of presentations, Felicia.
Thank you. First, thanks to Gary and Noam and Hannah for making sure that we were all here. And thanks to my fellow panelists. I have learned so much listening to you talk about the decline of mass politics and the rise of public cynicism. Because those are very helpful explanatory conditions for me as I think about what it will take to rebuild a moral politics, in this case in the United States, but a moral politics generally. I believe that all politics are moral, and we are at great risk if we are not able to actually rebuild, as Jen Harris said, the good movie version of a moral politics. But what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of my version of the recounting of the moral politics of the Biden era. So first of all, I would say that post-neoliberal thinking, and Angus, I'm using air quotes, but it is the title of the conference. Post-neoliberal thinking, by which I mean thinking about economics and society that goes well beyond the strictures of the market. Post-neoliberal thinking has long been full of moral claims, including on the left and especially on the left. This was very true of the thinking of a number of us in the United States who met consistently from about 2018 onward, just after the Cedar Brook conference that a number of people have referenced. Heather Boucher, Jen Harris, Larry Kramer, a number of us met mostly with the political economy bent, and our goal was really to learn, to strategize, and to push for new paradigms. Now, what was interesting about the conversations that we had in these more or less quarterly meetings was that it was very, very, very moral. That's how we started these conversations. Sabeel Rahman, whom some of you may know, who was part of our group, and then went on to run OIRA, which is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Biden White House. Sabeel's actually written well about this. He wrote a piece in Democracy Journal in early 2019, in which he called for a much richer form of freedom in the post-neoliberal age. He talked about freedom from domination, but what's very clear from looking at that and many other pieces from that era is that we all thought about this in moral terms, right? And we connected our desire to find a post-neoliberal politics, a new paradigm, we connected it very clearly back to other social movements. Not just 2011's Occupy. It is very important, by the way, that we are the 99% is a moral claim. But we connected our work back to 1999 and the battle in Seattle and the fight against globalization. And certainly the movements in the United States and globally, but that came directly after, as we were really meeting, 2019 and 2020 saw the Green New Deal and the movement for Black Lives. These were all movements that were full of moral claims. So then what happened, right? Because those moral arguments were really lost as these ideas were translated into policy during the Biden years. And I would argue that this lost in translation problem has had enormous political implications. I believe that the lack of a publicly available moral core to any of that very difficult and hard and I would argue largely successful policy work that a number of people did, certainly a number of people in this room did, but that loss of a moral core was really the reason, a core reason anyway, that we never built a mass politics around these signature legislative and policy achievements. I want to be very clear that the Biden policies were both post-neoliberal. They were about progressive market crafting, and these policies actually did have moral claims. I'll name just 5. First, the American Rescue Plan of 2021. In this COVID rescue, policymakers were very clear to put an emphasis on full employment, the idea that workers must not lose their jobs, that small businesses must not lose their incomes, their shops, and more fundamentally, that everyone who wanted to work should be able to. That was one of the driving goals of the 2021 legislation, and this is a moral claim. Relatedly, Jake Sullivan and Jen Harris have regularly argued from their seats in the White House, most famously in a speech that Jake gave in April 2023, which I think people mentioned last night, but in work really that goes back a decade. Jake and Jen and others argued that America's industrial base had been hollowed out, but it didn't have to be, and that it was government's job to fix this. This is a moral claim. So that's the first thing, full employment. Secondly, the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate bill of 2022, was premised on a set of moral ideas, that government action is required to combat climate change, and that we, government, the state, the society, could do so more universally, more holistically, with speed and at scale. This, too, is a moral claim. This was the baseline for this more fulsome version of industrial policy that people talked about yesterday. Mariana Mazzucato has talked about this as mission economics. But the fight against climate change is a moral fight, especially trying to do so equitably and at speed. The third piece of Biden, Biden-era legislation, Biden-era policy that was moral would be the antitrust efforts, led by Tim Wu in the White House, Lena Khan at the FTC, Jason Cantor at the DOJ. Basically, this work in the United States was premised on the idea that companies should not use their market power to extract, should not use their market power to dominate, and that good policy and good governance could do something about that. The fourth piece of policy that I would say is moral was the whole of government approach to right racial injustice and to correct for racialized economic rules that in the United States actually predate the founding of the Republic. But certainly the early Biden years saw the most vocal and most fulsome effort to try to actually right these kinds of racialized injustices, especially as they played out in the economy, right? Biden himself talked about the murder of George Floyd as, quote, a knee in the neck of justice for Black Americans. And the way that the Biden team tried to rectify this was in part through greater access to capital and greater employment for Americans of color. And then finally, I think the last claim in Biden world that was moral was that inequality itself would damage democracy. That if you have an economy that leaves some people to write the rules, a very few number of people to write the rules, and the rest of us to suffer the consequences, that means that you have the vast majority of people living paycheck to paycheck and simply not able to have the kind of agency in their lives that's going to mean that they can participate in our democracy. So the question is, what happened to these moral claims? Why is it that all of these policies, which everybody working on, I am convinced that they all thought, I was on the outside mostly, but we were doing this for good, they were doing this for good, so what happened to the moral claims? Why weren't those claims clear in the eyes of the public? I mean, I don't really know, but this is some speculation. First, I think that the DC policy machine, the way that most of us, this gets talked about and reported, is just not well suited to make these kinds of moral arguments. Early on in the 2020 campaign, of course, that was the ideas primary. It was very exciting, but increasingly the conversation in that primary race for the presidency focused on the what and not the why. So it was sort of like, would Warren's wealth tax be better than Bernie's wealth tax, which is more feasible, which is more constitutional? Where is Biden on taxation? How many tax plans does Biden have? What does it add up to? Very quickly, the conversation went from a conversation about wealth to a conversation about percentage rates. And of course, as this conversation moved even further into, once Biden won the election, we had a 2022 debate over Build Back Better. That clearly became a conversation about the horse race. What's in, what's out, who talked to Manchin last, who talked to Sinema last, like all of the reasons for doing this policy were more or less lost in the reporting. So I think that's one reason that we lost the moral claims. I think a second reason is actually because we as Americans, we as American experts, we as American commentators, we as American citizens really do not know how to talk about race and class. We don't know what to foreground, we don't know what to background. This is obviously a long-standing debate. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now, but I do think that when we struggle with this makes many, many, many of our moral, like talking about morality in our kind of everyday politics, it makes it much harder. So that's the second reason. The third reason I think the day-to-day of policy implementation was not great. It was harder than many people thought, and so the focus of the conversation went to that set of difficulties. How much money has gone out? Who's going to get the tax credits? Where are the tax credits? Are they, what's going through the Department of Treasury? What's going through the Department of Energy? Why is it so slow? Why is it so complicated? Who's, wired to get the tax credits? So all of this became the focus of the conversation rather than the moral claims. Two last reasons that I think we lost the moral thread. One is obviously inflation, right? Sacha just made the argument that inflation is, you can definitely make moral claims about people not being able to afford their lives, but inflation was so overwhelming everywhere, but in the United States in 2022 especially, 2021, 2022, that we talked about it not in those kinds of moral ways, but the Biden team in particular talked about it in a very defensive way. It's not our fault. Look, it's global. And also the tools that the Biden team had to combat inflation, they basically lacked, the Biden team lacked agency. Like, Will the Fed raise rates became the conversation. So the inflation conversation, again, overwhelmed a lot of the other policy conversations. And then finally, Sacha may very well be right, I'm sure you're right, Sacha, that like politicians, qua politicians, just struggle to make moral arguments when they are seen as so corrupt, so in the tank, et cetera. And mostly in the US and elsewhere, we rely on politicians to make these arguments. Even now in the United States, like who's going to be what's the Democratic primary going to look like? Because that's the next time we're going to have a megaphone to make these arguments. But if politicians are very ill-suited to make these arguments, then we are really up a creek without a paddle. So the result of this moral shrinkage, as it were, is that we had no mass politics that really followed the 2020 presidential win. We had no mass politics that followed the 2022 legislative wins. And you could absolutely see the effects in 2024. Anton talks about this in a much more global sense. But I think that the cynicism, the deep, the absolute cratering, you look at any of the measures on trust, political trust in the United States, they have just fallen off a cliff. The lack of trust in the Democratic Party, the Democratic brand is underwater, somewhere in the mid-30s, mid 30% of people believe in the Democratic brand. The most successful Democratic politicians right now are running against the party. Even people who hope to be president, mostly they get on TV by saying that the brand is underwater, is in real trouble. And so it's not that you didn't see an argument that was the Democrats tried to tame the power of capital, but they lost. They gave it their best shot, but they lost. You didn't see that argument. You didn't see the argument that the Democrats tried to beat Donald Trump, who was like a grifter and a con man. They lost, but they gave it their best shot. You don't see those arguments at all. What you see now, again, as Sacha said, is that it's basically the Democrats are as bad as the other guy. They try to hide it, and he doesn't. So the question is now how to break through. I will finish up. I do think that politically any successful left movement or any center-left big tent coalition, I actually think we need both, will need to make moral claims. I will say that the American right absolutely and very clearly makes moral claims. They say, J.D. Vance said just the other day, and I quote, "You love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that you can focus on and prioritize the rest of the world." These are claims about the good life, being rooted in family and being rooted in community. And for many people, I think they're quite effective. I think we on the left can and should make moral claims. We have them, as I tried to say. We have embraced ideas of economic dignity. We have embraced ideas of a deeper freedom. I rep FDR, so I will say that a deeper view of freedom includes freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, and freedom of worship, a much more fulsome version of freedom. But it is going to be very hard for anyone to make these claims given the uphill structural constraints that many people have talked about over the last day and a half. Last thing I'll say is that Angus argued earlier this morning that this is about narrative. I don't disagree, but I think it goes far beyond narrative because, at least in American politics, narrative is often still top-down. It often feels like it's kind of cooked up in a consultant's lab, what are the right words to say? But I think that what we need is deeper than that. We need a mass politics that is a much more organic set of beliefs, that is stickier, that does not need expert explanation, that maybe listens to some of the people that Sacha talks to. Much deeper listening, we're not very good at that, and ultimately I think that is what will be required if we're going to connect our policy and political claims, which are important, to a much deeper and more culturally resonant upwelling from citizens and voters. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for the 4 really stimulating and I think really thoughtful presentations. Already I've got people indicating they want to ask questions. I'm going to ask just one of each panelist and ask for very brief answers because I do want to get other questions in. Let me just start with you, Sacha, just particularly having listened to Jason's characterization, sort of focus on the sort of contradictions, I suppose, of in moral terms of capitalism and the different accounts of that we've had. Going back to your focus groups and the people you talked to and listened to, you said a little bit about the sort of valorization of entrepreneurs and so on, but can you just give us a little bit more of a sense of whether, did you pick this up, this sense of that there are good capitalists, bad capitalists, were there kind of moral judgments being made around this axis that Jason identifies?
Yeah, absolutely. And so lots of the people I spoke to are very unwilling to criticize wealth per se, even though I personally am very happy criticizing wealth per se. But lots of the, so on the one hand, yeah, you had a sense that, yeah, that's great. There were people who were the good wealthy, and they did philanthropy, and they created jobs and investment. And on the other hand, you had the bad wealthy, which in Mansfield and in North Nottinghamshire is especially someone like Mike Ashley. People from Britain might be familiar, the Sports Direct owner and billionaire who came overhead in his chopper twice a day when he was running Sports Direct just north of Mansfield, and he was associated with labor exploitation, excessive wealth, greed. And so, yes, people were very inclined to go for the good wealthy versus the bad wealthy, which was tricky because I wanted to make an argument about the corrosive effects of excessive wealth per se, and that was sometimes difficult.
Thank you. Jason, just to you, can you just clarify where neoliberalism sort of sits within the picture you're painting, which is obviously, I mean, here we're thinking about capitalism, which are obviously of a different kind of order in terms of these arguments. I mean, is your sense that neoliberalism has, to really pin you down, has it in part succeeded because it had a way of talking to and representing this dual character?
So I don't know that I would say that it succeeded in this way, but certainly it offered a sort of moral valor to entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurship, the idea that one could do it themselves through the market. It, of course, one of neoliberalism's sort of most powerful elements is the way it cloaked the role of the state. So it made the state seem invisible. It made it seem that it was a market that had superseded the state when, of course, neoliberalism fundamentally relied on the states in a variety of ways in its regulatory and legal capacities. And in many respects, was a way in which the state worked through the market. So I think that's also was one of its strengths, precisely because it could build on the sort of idea that the state was a sort of grabbing hand, the state was corrupt, and so forth, while offering an alternative. The third, I think, a sort of strength of neoliberalism was the way in which it coupled ideas of economic freedom with political liberty. I think that was also crucial. Yet despite these three strengths, we're here at a conference which has been titled Beyond Neoliberalism. So clearly there are weaknesses in the armor of neoliberalism. I mean, some of that could just be in the outcomes. This is, of course, has been especially clear in the developing world since, at least the late 1970s, with the sort of particularly with the growing role of the bank and the fund and the Washington Consensus, coming out of the 70s crises. And it's obviously become apparent in the global north as well, maybe especially since the 2007-2008 financial crisis.
Great, thank you. To you, Anton, very, very striking sort of picture or story that you're telling here. I just wanted to go back. I was thinking about so you cite Peter Mayer, so obviously, his account, I'm sure many people here will know it, sort of suggests that depoliticization, which is what he was looking at when he was writing that book, Ruling the Void, it is effectively a product of the sort of hollowing out of the party system and of the parties becoming sort of disembedded from civil society. What, I suppose, you're rolling that on and saying, well, here we are in this era of hyper-politicization. But I just wonder, in a way, is Peter Mayer's account still right, actually? Is it still, in many ways, the failures of the sort of mainstream political parties, maybe not just as in representative terms, but also going to the point that Jason's just made, in policy terms, that is also driving this sort of impulse? And if that's right, shouldn't we be thinking about rebuilding conventional political structures?
Yes, so speaking to Mayer, I think it's still right, because what he was mainly diagnosing is an era that has passed, which was that double era of post-politics in which both the social and the political axis drop. He had a lot to say about the political axis, so in his famous article in New Left Review, which launches the thesis, he first talks about declining electoral turnout and how he says it's a bit like global warming. It goes very steadily, but you can see what direction it's headed in. And the second is an institutional story about declining membership and then cartelization, so the mutual retreat of citizens and politicians from society, on the one hand into individualism, on the other hand into the state. And I think that era has ended on one axis insofar as the politicization axis has changed. He was not, I think, around to see it change. There's a lot of interesting work about like the new parties that are around that in many ways don't look like conventional parties. So digital parties or populist parties are very leader-heavy or very top-heavy, and they don't function in the way that these 20th century parties do. I think there is an argument to be made about the deeper causality that drove this disembedding he's talking about. And there's a critique by Wolfgang Strick of this book which actually says, where's the economics in this? This is a political story, it's a description, but it's not an explanation of what actually happens. And there you need a story, I think, of how the stagflationary crisis of the 1970s was resolved politically. So that's a story of what kind of class offensive neoliberalism had, because the diagnosis in the 70s becomes, and for example, Samuel Huntington's report for the Trilateral Commission is really prototypical for this, where he says, inflation is not exclusive to democracies, but it's made worse by democracies. Inflation is the economic disease of democracies. What do you do to solve the stagflation crisis? Well, you have to do two things. You have to break the control of interest groups, so popular pressure groups on the state, and you have to break labor unions, because those are the two drivers of inflation. And I mean, we can contest that etiology of inflation. Many people have said that's not a good way to understand where inflation in the 70s came from. But it is at least the narrative on which many policymakers settle, and it's also the story by which central banks then control the stagflationary crisis of the 80s, which I think, and Strick is right to point out, is the economic background to the political story that Mayer tells, which I think he hasn't fully economically embedded in his narrative.
Okay. Thank you. And then finally, Felicia, very, very interesting reflections from you. I guess I just wanted to pick up on your, I think it's one of your final points, where you mentioned something like almost an ethic of humility that might be needed, and obviously, and hinted at maybe a sort of exercise of listening as much as preaching as well, I guess. I mean, just tell us a little bit more about that. Is your sense that there is, amongst those who are now in the US, debating this, some of whom are here very heavily, what went wrong, why did all the policy that was enacted not produce that benefit? Do you think that is leading to a kind of deeper reflection about, you know, the kind of moral underpinning and the orientation and the telling of the story morally?
Yes.
Right.
Most of many of my colleagues are trying to ask now about whether there isn't what is the deeper cultural underpinning that people who are policy experts are missing in trying to devise both policies and political campaigns. There are many efforts which are actually quite difficult for interesting kind of mini cultural reasons, but there's a lot of efforts for folks from movement organizations like community organizers, folks from labor, folks from membership-led advocacy organizations, and then people from, you know, think tanks, policy experts, to spend more time together, to learn from each other. And there's an effort for all of us who like run things to learn from our members to figure out how, my organization doesn't have members, but from people who are members of organizations. So there's a huge effort to do this. It is quite difficult, in part because membership organizations themselves are so attenuated. But there's a really big effort to do something differently and to actually to listen differently. I fear that the consultant industrial class will rear its ugly head again. We are about to hit the US midterms like head on. And the people who are set up to tell you what the voters think are actually the pollsters who were part of the problem in the first place. So we'll see if these new efforts are successful, but they're certainly efforts.
Thank you. Okay, so it's over to you now. So have we got microphones there? I'm going to start with this side of the room, and then I'll come to this side of the room. So we'll do 2 rounds. So the woman over there in green had her hand up early on.
Hi, thanks for this. Just one question, one sentence really. Just does any of you feel that some legitimacy was lost because of Gaza and Palestine? So, and I'm very surprised that it hasn't come up at all in the discussion.
Thank you. So there were Path next, and then you. So can we have a microphone here? The guy in the middle. Oh, you've got it.
I'd like to ask the panel what they think a moral vision that can compete with ethno-nationalism is. Because if I think about the dominant moral vision of the post-neoliberal world to date, I would say it's that. And specifically whether they think it's some kind of progressive basis of a national collective, or whether it's a return to social class, which is, again, interestingly not come up yet.
Thank you. I think class was mentioned once. I think I heard it. And then this is guy here.
I had a question, and this is kind of more of a sort of category question of, are we missing an aspect of the fact that people spend a huge amount of time in the digital realm now, like on their phones? So if you look at data on phone usage, people spend like 6-7 hours a day on screen, so their reality is not in the physical world, it's in the digital world. And then in that, there's very vibrant sets of communities, WhatsApp groups, huge amounts of activity through there. So perhaps we're missing this whole universe of activity that's going on, organization, groups, facts, reality, whatever, influences and so on, that we're just missing completely. And if you look at, say, Trump's prime, so to speak, he's mapped out that space really quite well. And I think maybe on the left, progressive, they just completely miss this side. And it's a rich source of data to understand what people are thinking and how to organize and so on. So I just had a question around that all. And the second question, sorry to hog the thing, was...
I think we're just going to have one, because I'm really keen to get others in. Thank you. So we don't have to have everyone answering everything, but I'd like to get at least one answer to each question. So we've got 3 questions there: Gaza, Palestine. Then we've got the what is the alternative, what's the competing moral vision to ethno-nationalism? And then we've got the sort of digital realm dimension. Let's go down the other way. Felicia, what would you like to pick up on?
Which one do you want me to take?
Well, what would you like to answer?
Quickly, yes, absolutely. Gaza was a major contributory factor to the Democrats' loss of legitimacy, to the Biden folks' loss of legitimacy. So yes to Gaza as a huge challenge. I'll just say quickly that I also think this rebuilding of a moral politics is extremely difficult in a highly degraded media environment, which I think I mentioned. So I think that's to your question. I don't think we know how to do it, frankly. And then finally, I do think an alternative could start with, could actually start with equality. We can talk more about that if you want to. I'm not going to monopolize the time, but I do think there are legitimate alternatives. I don't know that we know how to plumb them for all their depths.
Thank you. Does anyone want to come in on the second question there? They're just about the alternative to ethno-nationalism. Any one of you want to pick up on that? Hesitation?
I mean, I'll keep going.
No, it's okay. Anton, do you want?
Yes, I mean, maybe we can say something about left populism, because there were 2 variants of populism in the 2010s, which in many ways are also an expression of the repoliticization describe or try to describe. And it seems that after 2010s, the only man standing on the populist side of the spectrum is the right variant and not the left variant, or at least the left populist variant is on the return, certainly in its southern European iteration, but also in France, etc., etc. And and there's two questions you can ask. Why is that? I think the first is just an asymmetry question, is that politics is less expensive on the populist right. The demands are less ambitious. I mean, if you want to actually restructure the entire Eurozone to reverse Greek austerity, that is much harder than certain types of cultural wars, which I think the populist right, which in many ways, of course, has grievances they can exploit, but which I think the policy proposals are often quite vague. It's an asymmetry between left and right there. But there's also an institutionalization question because, I mean, we can talk about narrative, but it risks degenerating quite quickly into PR talk because the question is not what story you tell. The question is how does a story reach certain people, and you need certain institutions for that. And the fact that many of these left populists were quite under-institutionalized or weren't able to rebuild the kind of structures that were typical for the 20th century, for the reasons I tried to learn out, makes it very difficult to actually let, and this also concerns, as you say, an alternative media sphere, because if you have to play the game by the existing media sphere, it's very, very difficult. I think that explains why the left populist answer to post-neoliberalism is now losing out to the ethno-nationalist variant that was lined out just in the question before.
Thank you. I just want to get a quick answer on the digital point. Sacha, can I just put you on the spot here? Because often, when people who do the kind of research you do, often, one counter view will be to say, well, aren't these people leading a lot of their lives online? Isn't there a whole kind of hinterland there that you may not pick up through that kind of ethnographic method? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, two things. One, of course, we talk about it. When I do interviews, when people share stories, I ask them where they get their stories from. Obviously, it's a hugely important part of people's lives and their lived experience. It's a part that ethnographers like myself are less able to pick up on, but it comes through the stories people tell. The second thing is that sociologists of storytelling have often described stories as being elusive, which is to say that stories don't stand alone, but they get their strength and their power from alluding to other stories. And so that takes us away from a binary between like lived experience on the one hand and like false consciousness on the other, or indoctrination or what have you. And instead you get this layering of stories, bits of experience, bits of rumor, and indeed bits of TikTok content. And they get layered over each other, and that's how stories become powerful, and that's what we need to understand, rather than sort of an opposition between digital life and sort of physical space, as it were.
Thank you. Jason, do you want to come in on any of those?
Yeah, sure. Just maybe quickly on information through social media. So there's nothing deterministic, I think, about whether the right or the left is able to benefit. In the very far long ago days in the US, Obama team was very strong on digital communications. That was one of the strengths there. So it's certainly not deterministic. But one thing that we know about social media might be useful, which unfortunately the social media platforms have fully been exploiting, which is this idea that anger and negative emotions are draw much more eyeballs and clicks than do positive things. And so the particular kind of rhetoric that we've seen animating much of the right sort of maps much more closely onto this understanding that we have of how social media works.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to now emancipate this side of the room. If you have the hand up again, this chap's been waiting.
Thank you. Desmond King from Oxford. Felicia, you raised your fourth explanatory factor was America's racial divisions, but you didn't say very much about them. One analysis, I think, is that the Republicans picked a white protectionist to be their presidential candidate. He was successful. He controls the Republican Party, and that was the agenda that was pushed forward. It's a very, very powerful, important explanatory factor, and it's very popular with Americans. It helps explain the puzzlement of the debate last night with our three economists about why economic issues weren't that important. For voters, this racial divide was way, way, way more important. Sacha, could you tell us the ethnic composition of Mansfield, please?
Okay, so you had two questions there, which is cheating. We'll allow one. So at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. I also have a question based on your comment, Felicia. So there's this argument that Republicans and the Democratic Party are inherently asymmetric, where the Republicans are more of an ideological party that is more committed to more abstract normative goals, whilst the Democratic is more a coalition of different social groups, which make it inherently more difficult to kind of construct this moral narrative. So do you have any thoughts on how perhaps these problems arising from the heterogeneity of the constituency can be overcome?
Thank you, and I saw there was a third hand. Yeah, just in front here. Chap with glasses.
Thanks. Matthew Lockwood from Sussex University. So I'm really struck by this panel because a lot of the conferences has been framed in terms of market versus state. And it seems from what people are saying that actually a lot of voters and publics are now fed up with both. In the 70s they were fed up with the state and turned to the market, but now they've had it with both. Which makes it actually really difficult for politicians because they're acting from within the state. It's really, and at the same time they're not trusted. And it's striking that right populist politicians often portray themselves as being outside politics and outside the state, even when they're running the state. So I guess my question is, do you think that we've been talking a lot about moral messages, but does the messenger also, who the messenger is, also really matter? And in a way, what I'm kind of sort of taking away from the panel is perhaps the idea that what is needed is not necessarily a new kind of politics, but new social movements. But they have to be institutionalized, and that's where Anton's sort of challenge comes in. But that's my question.
Thank you, it's a great question. So we have three questions there. One, the sort of politics of race in the US context. The second is specifically to Felicia, I think, about your understanding of the kind of coalition politics in relation to the Democrats. And then this third question I want to get to, have a very quick response from each of you, because I think it actually pertains to all four of your talks. So Felicia, do you want to start?
Well, I can take the heterogeneous and the race questions together. I think the question of race in America, and in particular the effect of America's racial politics on our electoral system, is incredibly vexing. And I will say that I think all the time about the fact that in the summer of 2020, 25 million people worldwide, including the preponderance of whom were American, were in the streets to protest George Floyd's murder. And I was worried then, I continue to worry now, that neither political party, certainly not the Democratic Party, and no social movement had anything to tell people. Nobody knew what to do with that frustration, with that anger. And I think that is in part a failing of politics, but in part a failing of policy, but in part also a failing of social movements. I also will say, and this gets to the heterogeneous question, I have been one of those people who thought that a kind of class analysis in the United States, which is very foreign, of course, to the way many Americans think, but still, a kind of class analysis built on the experience of 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, the We Are the 99%, could in fact provide the basis for a slightly more solidaristic racial politics. But in order for that to happen, you really would have had to, you need a very skilled political leader, and you need a more coherent party leadership. This is less about the heterogeneity of factions, because there are factions on both sides of the American right and the American left. But you would have needed a much more solidaristic leader, and I think Joe Biden had many strengths, actually, certainly in the beginning, but he was not that kind of solidaristic leader.
Thank you. This final question, looking at the rest of the panel, would anyone like to pick this question up about the challenge, I suppose, of thinking of politicians as sort of messengers for deliverers of moral messages? Who would like to go first? Jason, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So just on the last question, so I think you're right with this kind of idea that people being fed up with both the market and the state. One way perhaps of thinking about an outcome from this is the extent to which we have this kind of personalistic kind of politics. So obviously we've talked ad nauseum about Trump and maybe mentioned Musk. We might also think about Narendra Modi in India. And we may think about other figures in other parts of the world as well, Bolsonaro perhaps in Brazil, who sort of straddle this line of being pro-business, but then part of the state, but then anti-state, even though they're in the state, and somehow they're managed to navigate this sort of what might otherwise seem as a sort of treacherous path between the two, while still delivering a clear message, deeply moralized, of course, along lines that are, ethno-nationalist or Hindu nationalist, etc.
Thank you. Sacha, do you want to?
Yeah, I want to qualify actually that the point about people being against the state, because the people I speak to are also like, when I speak to them about price controls, rent controls, public ownership, they love it. So it's not the state being bad per se, it's the politicians. And that obviously gets you into really tricky territory. How do you deal with that in terms of the messaging? I think that is about infrastructures that can't just be messages or messengers. I don't believe that there's a shortcut to rebuilding local institutions, to rebuilding your, whether it's your allotments, whether it's your libraries, whether it's your sports clubs. There need to be those local infrastructures where people are proximate, where people are trusted, where they have the opportunity to show that they are on your side, that they will fight for you. That is hard work, but it's work that we need to be doing. On the racial composition of Mansfield, it's incredibly white, and yeah, certainly.
Thank you. So, the final word, Anton?
Yes. So I think abstract calls for more social movements really bypass the concrete institutional question of what that means. So I talk about there's a lot of repoliticization. Once again, the cost of political what does it mean, social movements, as a kind of abstract term in an age in which repoliticization is everywhere, but its institutional correlates are very, very vague. I mean, there's a very famous paper that bases itself off Robert Putnam, which is called Bowling for Hitler. And it's very specifically, obviously, of the civic basis of the Nazi Party, which was actually very impressive because they infiltrated both non-political and obviously political institutions. And this is how the strength of the Nazi coalition was actually constructed in the 1930s. There's now research on what they call golfing for Trump. So you can do any kind of variation, obviously, in social science as to what the civic basis of different coalitions are. But at the same time, I mean, Trump is more like the Weberian charisma figure than he is like a Hitler who was really a party creature. He's the product of a party, and the story of Nazism is really of a party colonizing the state, not just a small clique. And I mean, just one point from the news recently. I think last week Reform UK announced that they opened a pub. Yeah. So they've opened a pub. I mean, it's an interesting pub. It has like the Reform logo on it. You can drink specific kinds of beers there. So at least there seems to be some learning curve on that part of the right, that the types of entrepreneurial politics or ventures they had are maybe not the best to stabilize your party across electoral cycles and thereby really build counterpower. So at least there seems to be something there. On the left, there have been these initiatives, but it's very hard. It's very hard because the pull of the exit, to use Hirschman's term, is enormously, is larger than ever, I think, than in the 20th century. And you can see it, of course, in the fact that, I mean, if your entire day is spent on your phone, the kind of face-to-face interaction that usually leads to institution building becomes much harder.
Thank you, and thank you to all of those of you putting questions. We have come to time because I'm aware that you need a bit of a break before your next session. So Gary's just told me you have half an hour for a break, so reconvene at 4:45. And can you just join me in thanking our panel?